Greetings, Ruslan Bailov here, and today we'll analyze the operational situation on the Ukrainian theater of military operations. Well, comrades, the past day proved to be truly outstanding and extraordinarily saturated with important events from the line of contact for Russian forces. Numerous territorial successes were recorded across various directions. However, the unquestionably main achievement was the establishment of full and final control over the settlement of Siversk. Just yesterday, I lacked confirmed data. However, closer to lunchtime, I managed to contact servicemen who confirmed. Indeed, Siversk is under the control of Russian armed forces. Regarding the situation with Siversk, this is a truly outstanding achievement. Just imagine the scale of this event. The operation to capture the settlement was completed in 26 days. In other words, less than 1 calendar month. When was the last time something comparable occurred? Probably about 12 months ago, during the operation to take Novohradivka on the Pokrovsk direction. Nothing comparable in pace happened this year, but in this case we observe a flawless triumph of the South grouping units, a brilliant victory of all military formations that participated in battles for this seriously fortified urban area. Moreover, it's necessary to understand, Siversk's defense was held not by territorial defense representatives or mobilized citizens who were literally recently drafted from the streets and thrown to defend the city with the words, "Hold the defense." On the contrary, experienced and well-trained servicemen were stationed here who at one time for prolonged months held back the Russian offensive near Bilohorivka. And despite this, 26 days, and the settlement is already under Russian control. What could not be achieved at the very early stage of the conflict? And let me remind you, in July 2022, Russian formations entered Siversk and conducted assault operations for more than a month. However, at that stage, the operation ended in failure, and they had to roll back. For what reason did the operation fail then, but succeed now? The explanation is quite simple. At that stage, flank positions were not secured. Supply communications were not cut. No preparation for assault operations was conducted at all. Russian formations on the 23rd of July began a frontal attack on Siversk from the direction of Verkhnokamianska. Meanwhile, both from the north and south were AFU positions. Well, and the result was appropriate. Until the beginning of September, they unsuccessfully stormed the urban area and could not capture even half the city's territory, ultimately rolling back completely to the Luhansk region. This time the actions were significantly more thought out. Initially they executed a flanking maneuver from the northern direction, Bilohorivka, Hryhorivka, Serebranka, Dronovka, and then a dash to Platonivka, and control was established over the AA highway. The Lyman-Siversk route, a similar picture from the southern direction. That is Fedorivka, Pereizna, Kuzminivka, Vyimka, Zvanivka, and control initially by fire, and subsequently physical, over the supply communication to Siversk through Sviatopokrovska. Well, and when all supply routes came under control, the city was encircled from 3 directions. When fire assets were neutralized, well, and full-scale assault operations began. This brought results, as can be seen. I repeat, 26 days, and a well-fortified settlement is under Russian army control. I remind you that approximately 10,000 residents lived in the urban area before the conflict began, and this was one of the most powerful defense lines of Ukrainian formations on the Donbas direction. Although Ukrainian information sources predicted that Siversk would become for Russian troops a second Chasiv Yar, and Russian forces would get stuck here for at least 6 months, and possibly for a whole year. Well, a bit later, I believe, we'll examine in detail what prospects now open up, in what direction movement will develop, how effective it will prove to be. And for now, let's look at other advances. And we'll start with the Sumy region. Yes, even on the Sumy direction, gradual movement is observed. Here, units of the North grouping advanced 1.5 kilometers and reached the outskirts of the village of Andreevka, lost during the summer period. Moreover, they reached both the northern outskirts of the settlement and the eastern ones. So I think soon the settlement will again be under Russian control. That's the situation. Zelenskyy publicly made promises to kick out the Russians from the Sumy region by mid-October, and now it's already mid-December. And Russian fighters not only aren't retreating, but have again gone on the offensive and are advancing forward. However, things are significantly better for the north grouping in the north of Kharkiv region, the former Vovchansk direction. And now I'm not sure how to correctly call it, since it's still unclear where the main strike will be directed. Therefore, simply northern Kharkiv region. Here, units advanced simultaneously on 3 sections. First, they managed to enter the village of Prilipka and advance 350 meters through the residential area of the settlement. Well, considering that the village is small in size, I think in the very near future it will be under Russian control. In addition, they managed to accomplish something important. This is to establish control over the village of Lyman. And this is no longer a small settlement. Combat operations for it continued for 14 days. The AFU stubbornly resisted, but they couldn't hold the village. And now offensive operations are developing simultaneously in 2 directions. This is in the direction toward the Siversk Donets to the west, that is, to the village of Hravska. From current lines to the settlement is less than 1.5 kilometers. Well, and also fighters are moving south toward the village of Simonivka, and reports have already come in that Russian servicemen were recorded on the northern outskirts of the village. Well, this is understandable actually. Here the distance is only 400 meters between current lines and the village. Well, and an extremely significant advance was the breakthrough into the central part of the urban-type settlement of Vilcha. You know, Ukrainian military experts predicted that after the loss of Vovchansk, the center of their resistance, well, the center of AFU resistance on this section would become precisely this urban-type settlement. Well, because this is not some small village with a couple streets, but a real urban-type settlement. In it, for you to understand, 700 households. And they counted on the fact that since Russian formations took Vovchansk for a year and a half, they would get stuck here too. But their fortress didn't work out. Russian formations entered here also 14 days ago. Well, and now already 40% of the UTS is under Russian control. And combat operations are taking place in the central part, and even Russian servicemen have already been recorded in the southern part of Vilcha. So in fact here, possibly control is greater than what's colored in the end. In any case, I think before the end of the month Russian formations will finish off Vilcha. Well, and further, the AFU will simply have nothing to cling to. They'll have to roll back to Shesterivka, which is located 5 kilometers to the south. In general, as you can see, it was worth breaking AFU resistance in Vovchansk. It was worth finishing off the city, and that's it, the front here really activated to the fullest. Well, but in Kupyansk, not everything is favorable. Well, more precisely, not favorable at all. This is the zone of responsibility of a different grouping, the West grouping. Here the AFU managed to recapture the northern part of the right bank half of the city. Well, and Russian servicemen find themselves in quite a difficult position here. I don't want to create any panic, but there exists a risk, this is noticeable on the map as well, that the entire Russian grouping on the right bank could at one moment find itself in a blockade. So something needs to be done about this. We're moving forward with you. Regarding Mirnohrad, no news came in during the past day. Well, we all understand perfectly well that after Siversk, this is the next city in line that will be under Russian control. Well, either Mirnohrad or Rodinsky, and possibly both simultaneously. Both there and there AFU defense is cracking, and here's where there were more territorial successes, so in Zaparisia region, in the area of Stepnohirsk. Here, units of the Dnieper grouping took a most important height west of the UTS under control. So that's it, Stepnohirsk is doomed. Well, it was doomed anyway, since here the pocket of resistance is only in the very center, and even then AFU servicemen are in encirclement. But now, when we have the key height on this section, it's completely the end. Summing up the past day, 1 village and 1 city came under Russian control, and 34 square kilometers of territory. The AFU, in turn, recaptured 2.5 square kilometers. Well, for today regarding the situation on the front, I have everything. Now we move to reviewing the situation in politics. Something apparently happened with Zelenskyy. Remember how he constantly asserted that no, we won't give up any territory? Well, okay, generally the leitmotif was there, borders of 91st year. Then it was, we won't give up a single meter of land. And now he declares, well, this should be decided by the people of Ukraine. Yes, we'll hold a referendum there if needed. Well, if they vote, yes, let the people of Ukraine decide. Well, it's clear, he just wants to remove responsibility from himself for complete failure. Doesn't want to bear responsibility for withdrawing the AFU from Donetsk region. Let Ukrainians vote. If they vote to withdraw, we'll withdraw, then I'm clean, and I'm not involved. Here's just the nuance. He's asking for the time of conducting that voting and presidential elections and referendum, that all this time there be a ceasefire. Will Russia go for such a thing? I think the answer is obvious. Trump called on the leaders of Great Britain, France, and Germany to put pressure on Zelenskyy so that he accepts the conditions of the peace plan. The Wall Street Journal writes about this. In a telephone conversation on the conflict in Ukraine with the participation of Starmer, Macron, and Merz, the US president stated that Kiev must agree to significant territorial losses and limit the number of its troops. The US president repeated his public criticism of Zelenskyy for the fact that he didn't read the peace plan. At the same time, Trump showed no signs that he's ready to reconsider the conditions proposed by Washington. The newspaper writes, citing sources, "I think the time has come to settle this war. I think it can be settled. But it takes two to tango," Trump stated. Zelenskyy needs to be a realist. They haven't had elections in a long time. They're losing enormous numbers of people. 82% of Ukrainians demand to conclude an agreement. They want an agreement to be concluded. I understand this. They're losing thousands and thousands of people every week. They want this to end. I think we had small disagreements about people, and we'll see how this ends. Paying no attention to Zelenskyy's calls to ensure security for holding elections, the US president again spoke about corruption, the absence of elections, and people's dissatisfaction. This isn't casting shade on anyone, but they have a huge corruption problem there. And people are asking, when will there be elections? And will there be any at all, or are they just going to continue like this? The USA transmitted to Europe a secret plan for Russia's return to the world economy, writes the Wall Street Journal, transmits Yuri Podolyaka. The American publication reports that Europe, and accordingly Ukraine, received Trump's secret plan in quotes, Russia's return to the world economy. No, I understand. American journalists too. You can't survive without attracting attention. But in my opinion, this is already a clear overreach. First, somehow secret, this was written in black and white in the so-called Trump plan of 28 points, which has long been passed into quotes and filed away. And secondly, what does Russia's return to the world economy have to do with it? In what way does the plan for using Russian money stuck in Europe, as well as the plan for forcing Europe to add even more of their own funds for Ukraine's restoration, so that the USA and Trump personally profit from this, relate to this? Meanwhile, these plans are planned to spend only half of the suspended Russian money and the same amount of European funds. And the rest should be spent on joint infrastructure American-Russian projects. Moreover, everyone understands that Europe will reject this plan. On what grounds should Europeans share with Trump money that they already consider their own and which they can use for war with Russia? But what's really important is that without accepting this generous offer from Trump, he generally refuses to meet not only with Zelenskyy, but also with EU countries. This is really very important and shows how much his position has changed since the summer period, changed in our favor. That's what a hint at money and its mastering does to a person. The USA transmitted to Europe a secret plan for the Russian Federation's return to the world economy, writes the Wall Street Journal. For Ukraine, it contains $200 billion in Russian assets for projects in Ukraine, including a large data processing center that will be powered by Zaparisia NPP. European officials were not thrilled with this plan. They fear that such an approach will give Russia breathing room to accelerate economic growth and strengthen its military power. Also in Europe, they fear that the American version will cross out Europe's own plans for supporting the Ukrainian government. A European official, commenting on the proposal, called them an economic version of the Yalta Conference of 1945, at which the war's victors divided Europe. This is like Yalta, he said. The result could radically change the economic picture of the continent, a European source stated. American representatives object to this point of view. In their opinion, the European approach will too quickly deplete frozen Russian funds, which they simply want to transfer to warring Ukraine. Washington proposes a different model: attract Wall Street leaders and large private funds for investing these assets and increasing the available volume of funds. One of the negotiation participants stated that under US management, such a fund could grow to $800 billion. "We really understand what financial growth is," he said. By the way, Trump called on Zelenskyy to recognize reality and hold elections. Ukraine is being shaken by a massive corruption scandal, and local authorities should already hold full elections, Donald Trump told journalists at the White House. Zelenskyy himself should be a realist. After all, 82% of his citizens demand peace, the US president believes. Trump assured that the conflict will end soon, and once again emphasized that nothing would have happened if he had been head of the states in 2022. European leaders very much want to meet with the American side already this weekend to discuss their alternative settlement plan. However, as Trump claims, the USA wants to clarify something before a possible meeting, so as not to waste time. America stopped moving. An indicative trend began to be observed in the USA. The level of horizontal mobility sharply fell to minimum values for the entire post-war period, since the 40s. Only 11% of Americans in 2024 changed their place of residence or moved to another state. For comparison, during the turbulent 60s period, 1/5 of the US population annually moved around the country. There are economic reasons for the fall in horizontal mobility. Mortgages against the background of increased rates became inaccessible for many. Buying a house in another state is already a non-trivial task, writes Malik Dudakov. As a rule, youth is always quickest to act. And precisely they have the most serious problems with housing in conditions of an inflated mortgage bubble. At the current moment, more than half of Americans aged 18 to 29 continue to live with parents. They lack money not only to buy housing with a mortgage, but even for rent, which has sharply increased in price. But there are also political factors. Liberal and conservative Americas are closing in on themselves. Republicans are grouping into their enclaves. Democrats are doing the same. Changing your state often means relocating to where your values will in no way be considered by local authorities. And this concerns everything, any of the agendas dividing the USA. The absence of horizontal mobility will aggravate the current split in the country. The two Americas will drift further and further from each other, reducing common ties. And against the background of complete dysfunction of the political system in Washington, sooner or later, this could lead to a radical scenario that will call into question the existence of the USA as a unified whole.